All right, welcome to the Beach Brothers Show, Virginia Business and Politics. Well, we really chop it up with some of the movers and shakers in the great state of Virginia about Virginia business and politics. So, Conrad, who do we have on the show?
Thank you again, Mr. Seko. Tonight is admittedly sort of a long show in the making, and I've wanted our guest on for almost a year. In 2020, he ran for Virginia's 7th congressional district seat. But beyond that, I've been a general fan of tonight's guest for even longer. In 2018, I began delving deeper into the political game. I advocated policy at the General Assembly. I watched the 2018 Virginia race for Senate. I went to fundraising events here in the 2nd District, and I saw Virginia Delegate Nick Freitas as a participant in all 3. I saw his assembly floor speeches going viral, even sometimes playing nationwide on Sean Hannity's television show. I could see then that his political resonance is strong and a talent beyond that of a typical politician. So even if I disagree on some policies, I respect the hell out of his game. I've heard from multiple Democrats, some being politicians too, that they're not a fan of Nick. But the way I see it, if you are strong on your political principles, then you'll gain an enemy or two. Regardless, he's impactful, and that's why we need Virginia Delegate Nick Freitas on the show tonight. So, Delegate, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys very much for the opportunity.
Awesome.
Good stuff. Hey, I want to tap it. Yep. I know, Conrad, that we got a nice flow. I want to tap in. One of the things about Nick that I don't think I've even shared with you, Conrad, is he was one of the politicians that I really looked at back in my 2018 run when I was going for the school board. As a matter of fact, I emailed your office asking if I could use the back of your boards. You actually received my vote in the Republican primary, so. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
This is
interesting. Was a pretty close primary, too.
It was. It was. As a matter of fact, watching that kind of inspired me in a lot of different ways, and it helped me dive a lot deeper into some of the mores and nuances of local politics. So, yeah, I'm glad to have Nick on today, too. Salute that.
So let's start at your beginning, Delegate. To my understanding, you were born in Chico, California, over in the northern section of the state. After high school, you joined the United States Army, then spent from 1998 until 2009 in the United States military. So can you break down the drive to join the armed forces and then break down your 11-year military career?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I was always interested in joining the military. It's funny. I tease people that my military career actually started off by applying to West Point. And I remember going in, me and a good buddy of mine, we were both going to go to West Point together. He was a lot smarter than I was, so he did very well, got in. And my math scores were just nowhere where they needed to be. And so I remember going through the review board, and they said, well, look, we want to look at some other options for you. Maybe you can enlist and then go to the Fort Monmouth, which is the prep academy. And so I said, okay, that sounds good. And I enlisted in the Army. I went infantry. So, Fort Benning, Georgia, got an airborne contract. So my first unit was the 82nd Airborne. But at that time, I was also dating Tina, who ended up becoming my wife, tricked her into marrying me at an early age. And what's interesting is that, and I talked to my commander about potentially going to the Fort Monmouth, again, the prep school for West Point. But then it would have been a year at Monmouth if I still could have got my math scores up, which there was no guarantee. And then it would have been 4 years at West Point. You can't get married at that time. And again, there's no way I was gonna. I had convinced her that I was marriage material. But if she would have had 5 years to realize that there was a big world out there and she had a lot of other much better options, there's no way she would have stuck with me. So I stayed enlisted. We got married at 19. I was in the 82nd Airborne Division. Got to go to Ranger School, Sniper School, Airborne, Air Assault, all that good stuff. And then I was actually going to get out of the military at that point. It was, 2000. And, I wasn't going to stay in. I was actually considering getting out and being a police officer like my father. And we decided to re-enlist for one more tour, went over to Hawaii, And about, gosh, I don't know, a couple months of us, 3 or 4 months after us arriving in Hawaii, September 11th happened. And at that point, I knew what I was going to do. So I volunteered for Army Special Forces, better known as Green Berets, which focuses on unconventional warfare and counterinsurgency. The other thing that's really unique about Green Berets is they spend, when you look at the way they conduct operations, it's always by, through, and with the local population, the indigenous population. And so you operate in a 12-man team, and I did 2 combat tours in Iraq, one in 06 and one in 08. Loved being SF, but I also was getting more and more frustrated with kind of how we were able or not able to conduct operations, and that led me to decide to get out of the military in 2009 at about 11 years. And but yeah, that was my saga in the military. I again loved it, loved being a Green Beret. It was a great experience.
All right.
You are a rhetorically strong Republican, so I want to compare it.
At least you didn't call me a sophist, right?
There we go. We've had Reagans, we've had Bushes, we've had McCains, we've had Romneys, we've had the establishment, we've had grassroots like the Tea Partiers, and of course we've had Donald Trump. To some, the Republican Party sort of keeps moving around. I'm reminded of the West Wing, where their fictional Republican presidential candidate, Arnold Vinnick, said, if this were Europe, the Republican Party would be 3 parties. This brings us the sort of depressed Republican voters. And I mean by that is the ones who, after Trump's loss, feel that there's no faith to be had in the voting system. You've run for the Republican Party and contested primaries and conventions and statewide for Senate and for delegate and for U.S. Congress. So overall, what makes you a Republican, and what can leaders like you do to unify the coalition of disaffected Republicans in so many different Republican branches?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at political parties in general, you're always going to get different factions within a particular party. The reason why, and again, I think a political party at the end of the day is it's a tool, right? It's a mechanism. You're joining a team because it's generally easier to get things done working as part of a team than it is, working as an individual. And of course, there's always going to be issues where you might not even see eye to eye with your own party or your own party's leadership. My emphasis, my political philosophy is really rooted in that idea of individual liberty. I believe that everybody's beautifully and wonderfully created. They have inherent value. That inherent value is not based off of how much money they have or how much political clout they have. You just have inherent value by virtue of being a human being. And so I place a very high premium on liberty and self-determination and being able to pretty much be the author of your own story. And I see government's primary role in that as to protect your rights, protect your property rights, and otherwise leave you free to live how you want. Now, again, going back to nuances, there's always areas where you can say, okay, is this an appropriate area for the government to intervene? Is this not? And I think you can have debates within those margins. A lot of it comes down to what is your entry point into the conversation when you're looking at policy? What's the fundamental starting point of your political philosophy? And again, mine is really rooted in individual liberty. And I would like to think that is still reflected within the Republican Party. That's certainly the Republican Party that I would like to continue to be a part of, and I want to push us more in that direction. But there's some work to be had there, because that's not necessarily what everybody who is a Republican believes. I think some people see a lot more aggressive role for government than I would be comfortable with in my own party. But I do think at a fundamental level there's still that commitment to the idea of government staying within its constitutional limitations and putting more emphasis on individual freedom and choice.
All right. Well, it looks to me like you had a really interesting background, but let's go back a little bit. You met your lovely wife back in high school, and your military career progressed, and then you both settled in Culpeper in 2009. So, one of the things that we really like to do on the Beach Brothers show is to highlight some of the great things in our great state. So, tell us about some of the really cool things in that area of Virginia, the unique things, what businesses are fantastic there. Let's big up and let's salute Culpeper. Tell us a little bit about that area. What's special about that area?
How much time do you have? I first visited Virginia when I was a teenager. I think I was like 13, 14 years old. I can't remember exactly, but I remember coming out here and we were touring battlefields and we were touring historic sites. And I'm a history buff. I love American history. And if you love American history, I mean, there's no better place to be than Virginia. But the other thing that struck me about coming out here, again, growing up in California, I mean, it's a beautiful state, weather's nice. But one of the things that really shocked me is how green it was. Because in California, by May, everything is like brown and dead, right? It's a much drier climate. It's a lot more humid in Virginia. So I remember coming out here and just thinking, gosh, it's not only so much history involved in everywhere you look, but I fell in love with it from a geographical standpoint. I think it's a beautiful. I think our Commonwealth's beautiful. I like the weather. I like having 4 seasons. And what attracted us to Culpeper is I remember I was going through the Special Forces qualification course at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I had a buddy stationed up here in Virginia. I came up and I told him, I said, look, I've always wanted to live in Virginia. I've never got to choose where I live. It's always, I was either, going through school as a kid, or I joined the military, and you don't get a lot of say in the military. I said, But when I get to choose, I want to live in Virginia. And he goes, you need to check out Culpeper. And so we drove out. This was, 6 or 7 years before I actually moved to Culpeper. I drove out there, looked around. I said, okay, this is where I'm going to live one day. And several years later in the military, 2 combat tours, I ended up getting a job in Virginia, and we lived in Woodbridge for a while as we looked for something out here, and came out to Culpeper, and I again fell in love with it all over again. And again, I love being in the Piedmont. You got rolling hills. It's beautiful. You got views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. In Culpeper, you go downtown on Davis Street. It's in a very historic street. You go grab your coffee at Raven's Nest. You go get your chocolates at Frenchman's Corner. You go, you go get your lunch at Time Inn. I mean, and you always run into people that you know. It's another thing. I remember growing up, my grandfather had this diner he went to, and he could go in, sit down, and they already knew what he wanted to order. And I feel like I've got that now with Frost Cafe on Davis Street, where I can go in or take my kids in, and so it really is, that sort of feel to it. And the neighboring areas that I represent, Orange and Madison, again, it's a similar feel. It's the Blue Ridge Mountains. Right up next to it with Madison. It's going to Montpelier down in Orange County. We love it, and it's been a great place to raise our kids.
Yeah. When you said how much time do you have, you weren't joking. You can really
I will filibuster on how much I love where I live.
Beautiful. Well, we're going from a nice, beautiful moment we discussed the beautiful areas of Virginia to one of the more dicey questions that one of our viewers. So, John Edgel, I'm sure you're familiar with John Edgel.
John loves me.
He asked the question, you've always said you're 100% pro-life, consistently saying that you supported a total ban on all abortion procedures. I'm not going to read the whole question. He actually didn't get a chance to post the entire question, but just give us your thoughts and your position on that dicey, challenging, controversial topic of abortion. Are you 100% against it? Are there special situations where it makes sense?
Well, I think well, first of all, let me kind of lay out my philosophy here. So when I look at the abortion issue, I try to break it down scientifically, right? There's this idea that if you're pro-life, it's automatically informed by your faith, and yeah, that's true. I certainly won't deny it, but I also look at it from a scientific perspective. So when I look at the biological textbooks on how do we distinguish between a living entity and a non-living entity, what I find is that at the moment of conception, you meet the scientific criteria for being a living entity. The next thing I look at is a human life between non-human life, and obviously there's distinctions that we make there as well. And once again, at the moment of conception, you have all of those characteristics to include, deoxyribonucleic acid, your DNA. You are a human life at the moment of conception. And so the question for me has been, okay, are you entitled to certain basic protections at that stage? And I would argue that you are. And in order to be intellectually consistent with the rest of my philosophy, I have to stand by that. Now, obviously, if you have a situation where the mother's life is at risk and she could die as a result of the pregnancy, no, I make exceptions for that. I think that makes sense, because you're talking about one human life and another human life. The problem I have is that when you look at the vast majority of abortions, and it's generally somewhere between 96 to over 97%, they're not done because of significant health risk to the mother. They're not done because of the life of the mother is at risk. They're essentially done because two consenting people decided to engage in an activity that they knew would bring about the absolute dependency of a human life, and now they don't want to follow through with that. And I just think there's a lot of problems with the government coming in and saying, well, in this particular case, you can destroy innocent human life if you don't, if you find it, and I don't mean this, I know this is going to sound harsh, but if you find it inconvenient. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent. And if I believe life is sacred, then I have to protect it, and I have to advocate for its protection, even if it's its initial and most vulnerable stages.
All right. What about in cases of pregnancy from rape or incest?
Typically when we talk about incest, we're also talking about rape associated with that as well. And again, I think that's obviously a far more difficult thing, because now you're talking about two victims. And in 97% of cases with abortion, and this is not just my numbers, this is according to places like the Guttmacher Institute, which is a pro-choice organization. You're not talking about two victims, you're talking about one. In the case of rape, you're talking about two victims. And so obviously I think that's a very different situation. I still think it's problematic when we say that an innocent third party is going to be harmed or is going to be destroyed because of the actions of somebody else. I still think that's a morally problematic argument to make, but I certainly understand that abortion in the case of rape is different than abortion in the case where someone is just, again, there was no victimization involved in the actual creation of the human life. So I make a distinction between the two, but I still think it's a morally tenuous argument to say that we can harm an innocent third party because of the actions of another.
Well, I appreciate your being full-throated on that, even though that's probably the touchiest topic to possibly touch on.
And can I say one other thing real quick on this? The other thing I think it's really important here, because Republicans do a horrible job of it, is that if you're only pro-life in the sense that you think there should be prohibitions on abortion, but you're not pro-life in the sense that you're willing to work with organizations like Crisis Pregnancy Center, like Thrive, like other organizations, that if you're not willing to reduce regulations that inappropriately make it expensive or prohibitive to adopt, then you're only being partially pro-life. I do work. My wife does work where we support organizations that do try to make things and resources and support available to mothers that find themselves in a situation that they didn't anticipate. And so for me, this is not about condemnation. It's not about judgment. It's not about telling someone that they're a horrible person. It really is about making sure that we can provide resources so people don't feel like they have to take that option.
Appreciate that expansion on that. Speaking of your wife, Tina happens to also be quite strong as a Republican, and she also happened to have participated in the 2019 process, specifically the race for District 24's Virginia Senate seat. So let's talk about Tina's work towards Senate District 24. Also, the slight oddity that in the primary, 19,400 people voted for the Republicans. The winner was Emmett Hanger. And now Hanger went on to receive 46,900 votes later that year. So why weren't there 49,000 votes in the Republican primary? Just a couple things.
Sure. I don't think, you never, first of all, I was very proud of the race Tina ran. She worked incredibly hard. I think she articulated what she believed very well. And again, it goes to show that, the Republican Party it doesn't mean that simply because we're Republicans, we agree with every Republican and that we're not willing to hold members of our own party accountable. But as far as participation in a primary versus participation in a general, that's pretty average. It's pretty standard. You don't have as many people come out to vote in a primary, even people that are affiliated or associate with that party, as you do in a general election. And so I don't think that there was anything really significant in this distinction between far less turnout in a primary than you would see in a general election. I think that's pretty standard.
All right. Hold on one second here. Computer froze a bit. Okay. Let's sort of move on to the making the argument portion of tonight's show. By the way, shout out to the Nick Freitas YouTube channel and the in-depth Making the Argument series. I want everyone to also take a look at that. The first topic, primaries versus conventions. The Democrat Party of Virginia's 2021 election process, they chose a primary. 5 are running for governor that I know of, 8 for lieutenant governor, 2 for attorney general. Republicans, I think there's about 6 that are running for governor, 4 for lieutenant governor, and 3 for attorney general. The Republican Party is doing a convention process, and many on the various young Republican groups are not liking that. Governor candidate Amanda Chase famously threatened to run independently if the party went on with that convention process. So let's make the argument. What process is the best way to determine a party's representative for Virginia office, a primary or a convention, or why?
I don't think it necessarily has to come down to, well, this one is the best one or that one's the best one. I think different of them, they each have advantages, they each have disadvantages. In a place where there is no party registration, and a lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea of running in a primary where essentially people who do not affiliate with your party or maybe don't share your values can essentially attempt to try to game the system, right? And we see that happening. Usually, I mean, in the state level, it's a little bit difficult to do, especially when you've got multiple people running on each ticket and the primaries the same day. But we have seen it before in Republican primaries in Virginia, especially ones where it was a deep red district. I would argue you saw some of that in the 24th Senate District when Tina ran, where you had people crossing over to vote in a Republican Party. Again, not because they intended to vote for the Republican in the general election, but because they saw it as an opportunity to, hey, if we're going to lose, we can get the Republican that we like better. So that's the justification for having conventions. There's also some arguments to be made that in a convention, it becomes a good opportunity to network among all the local GOP committees and things like that. So that's some of the advantages. The disadvantages associated with the convention is obviously it's a lot more complicated to have people actually show up and vote to it. Because typically, I mean, COVID aside, typically you have to show up at a centralized location, which Virginia is a big place. And so that can make it more difficult for people to get there. The way that you campaign for a convention is much different than how you campaign for a primary. Campaigning for a primary is a lot more like campaigning in a general. And so those are some of the disadvantages associated with a convention. Again, the benefits of a primary, you get to talk to a broader audience. It's easier for people to participate. The downside is that you do run into a situation where other people that can come in and essentially select your candidate. And one thing I think is important to remember is when you look at political parties, ultimately a political party is a private organization. Obviously, they're very public facing, but it is a private organization, and they should, as a private organization, have the ability to select who they want to represent them. One of the bills I actually carried in the General Assembly took away public financing for party primaries. And a lot of people thought I did that just because I favored conventions, and that wasn't the case at all. I have a problem with taxpayers being on the hook for private institutions like political parties to run a taxpayer-funded primary process. I think that we should have to fit the bill for our own process.
It's just a laundry bag with a head.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I hadn't considered that. I want to, before we move on, we talked about making the argument, and that's the name of your podcast. What brought you to that title? That's just a really compelling title.
Well, no, I appreciate it. Again, a big part of why I got into politics initially, it wasn't to run for public office. It was more to just to be engaged in the debate and of sitting down and using the laws of logic and rationale and science and reason in order to come up to logical conclusions about how we should govern ourselves. And so when we looked at the podcast and we looked at why I got into politics in the first place, I wanted to break down a lot of these individual issues and present an argument, not just to the echo chamber. I wanted to present a larger argument for anybody that was interested on why myself and other people that might associate their thoughts with my own, why we feel a certain way about certain policy positions. Because one of the problems I do see in politics right now, and I think, and look, we're all guilty of it at time. I don't excuse myself either. We break certain laws of civility when we discuss political issues. Sometimes we don't watch our tone, and I've been guilty of this. We assume bad things about another person simply because we have policy disagreements, and I wanted to have an opportunity to, again, lay out rational arguments for why I believe what I believe on a variety of issues, and so that's where we got the name, and that's really the purpose of the podcast.
Good stuff. Good stuff. We have another viewer question I want to pose. Do you practice the non-aggression principle? And if so, how do you reconcile yourself with running as a Republican instead of a Libertarian?
Sure. So again, let me answer the first one with the political party. Again, a political party is a tool. It's a mechanism. All right. So I'm not a Republican because I have an affinity for elephants, even though I think elephants are great. Right. It's a mechanism whereby you can, run for office and potentially push a political philosophy or advance a political philosophy that you agree with. And I do think the non-aggression principle, also kind of known as NAP, is a good guideline. I think it's a little bit problematic to play in the absolute, which is to say that in order to fully implement the non-aggression principle, you would have to be an anarchist. Because the non-aggression principle essentially says that you can't apply force in any circumstance. Now listen, I don't think it's an ignoble goal to try to move to an area where all of society is voluntary. I don't think that's a bad idea. I also don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. So I apply the non-aggression principle as certainly as much as possible and as practicable. It does inform a lot of what I look at. There's a lot of bills that come across that you'll see strong bipartisan support for, and I'll be one of the only no votes, simply because I think, again, my starting point is not, do I like this idea or do I not like this idea? Or do I like these stated objectives or not like the stated objectives? My starting point is usually, is this something we have to apply force in order to implement? Because that's what the government is. The government is the application of force. And I tend to focus on government intervention when we have what I call involuntary human interaction. So if someone's stealing from you, if they're hurting you, if they're robbing you, if they're murdering you, right? These are all appropriate areas, I think, for the government to intervene on behalf of an innocent party and to protect them. On a lot of other issues, I'm a lot more skeptical of government intervention simply because it does involve the use of force and coercion and is, as such, a violation of the non-aggression principle.
Interesting. I do like the fact that you say that political parties are tools.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean that as pejoratively as it sounds.
When I ran in 2018 for the school board, I did run with the Democratic Party, but I'm truly an independent, and so that was hard for me to reconcile. And, a lot of the mentors I was working with, the campaign managers I sat with, they said, look, you just can't run as an independent and win in Virginia Beach. You're going to have to saddle up with one of the parties, as despicable as you might find that. And so that's interesting that you said that out loud.
Yeah, well, no, and I think it's true. Again, I'm proud of being a Republican. It's not something that I run away from or shirk from. But again, ultimately, this is supposed to be about ideas. It's not just supposed to be about tribes. It's not supposed to be a cult of personality. It's supposed to be about advancing ideas. And obviously you're going to work with other people to advance certain ideas. And one of my favorite quotes by Frederick Douglass is, I'll work with anybody to do good and nobody to do evil. And I think that's a good principle to take into place even when you're working with a party.
I'd like to make another argument now, but this argument is going to start off hypothetical. So picture 2017's Virginia governor race, and let's say instead of yourself running for Senate in 2018, you ran for governor the year before and you won.
Okay.
Then March 2020 comes around.
Yeah.
Make the argument, how would Republican Nick Freitas have handled the Virginia executive decisions, specifically on COVID, and especially that of schools? And what would you do for schools and businesses right now?
Sure. Well, I think going into it now, presumably I would have had 3 years to govern before that, and hopefully I would have been able to get some good legislation passed. What's interesting is that if you look at some of the things that Governor Northam did when COVID really started to have a significant impact on Virginians, we started to roll back certain regulations that we had on things like telemedicine. We started to roll back different regulations we had on certificate of public need. We rolled back regulations on allowing for greater licensure reciprocity and licensure by endorsement of doctors so that we could get more people into Virginia where it needed to be. These are all things that I've advocated for prior to COVID, and I think COVID has exemplified why we're good policies. And so hopefully, instead of just reducing those regulations in a time of a crisis, we would have already removed a lot of those barriers. And so we would have had a healthcare system that would have been able to, a lot more flexible and able to adapt as necessary. I think as we also started to understand who was the most greatly affected by COVID. Obviously, everybody's affected by it in some way or another, whether it's through government policy or the sickness, it's the virus itself. But we also know now, and we started to really recognize this, and I think to some degree you could have logically concluded this, that when you're talking about a flu-type virus, that's going to affect certain members of the population worse than it is others. And so when we talk about areas like nursing homes, when we talk about people that already have compromised immune systems, I think focusing our resources and making sure that we deploy resources like the National Guard in order to make sure that we don't overwhelm our medical systems would have been really important. On the business front, I would have been far more open to the idea of businesses being able to adapt to the virus to be able to continue to operate, because I think one of the problems that we have to look at, there's this idea in government where we talk about solutions, when in reality, everything in government, whether we like it or not, everything in government is a trade-off. There are consequences to our actions, both good and bad, with respect to the policies that we implement. And it was amazing to watch as a lot of businesses were attempting to adjust, like distilleries that were attempting to adjust into hand sanitizer, that were worried about potential regulations or problems they could run into by shifting production into something that they hadn't done before. And so I think removing regulatory burdens and making it easier for people to operate and to facilitate our supply chains would have been far more effective. On the school front, again, presumably if I would have had 3 years to implement policies, we would have had mechanisms for a lot more school choice. And that would have created an environment where going into COVID, where all of a sudden it became theoretically a very bad idea to put hundreds of students into a cramped small building, especially teachers that were older, that did have potentially compromised immune systems that couldn't go back into the classroom. If we would have had more of a marketplace of ideas for education leading up to COVID, I think we would have been a lot more flexible. There would have been a lot more flexibility just inherent in our response. One of the things that's really frustrating to me is that every time we talk about providing parents more opportunities to be able to use their tax dollars in order to get education opportunities for their children, I always get told, well, you're against public education. Like, well, no, there's a whole variety of ways that you can fund public education. It doesn't all have to be a government school. It doesn't have to be a building that you send your kids to based off of your address. It can be a variety of things, and some of it can be in-person schooling, and some of it can be online, some of it can be tutors. And so I think, again, I would have liked to have seen a lot more options available to parents on how they allocated their own tax dollars toward education. And I think we would have seen a lot more innovation and a lot more adaptability, which would have helped students be able to continue on in their education in environments that were safe for them, safe for the teachers, and didn't cause them to fall significantly behind. So those are some of the policies that I certainly would have liked to have seen implemented.
That's interesting. That's very interesting, because yes, whenever you talk about school choice, it people say you're trying to destroy the school systems, and that's.
Well, I go back to this. Like when the government wanted to help hungry people, we didn't open up 10,000 government grocery stores and make you shop at one based off of your address. We provided a mechanism where people could go out into the marketplace and get the resources that they needed and that were unique to their individual needs. And I think just as we can recognize that, at least I think that the government taking over the grocery store industry would be a bad idea, I think we also need to be at least open to the idea that just as the private sector is able to respond to demand in every other area, this is another area where I think you could see a lot more innovation. I can't tell you how many teachers I talk to that are so frustrated because they got into education because they wanted to teach, and now they find themselves spending a significant portion of their work week focused on state and federal mandates in order to try to justify funding or teaching to a test that they don't think is productive for their students. And so I would love to see an environment where teachers have far more control over their classrooms than politicians do.
Interesting. We have another, using the word interesting, comment from one of our viewers. I'm sure everybody can read along, and of course, it's from John Edgel. And this deals with Cliff Maloney.
Oh, yeah.
So this is dealing with Cliff Maloney and repeated sexual harassment and abuse of countless young female staffers with the Young Americans for Liberty. You were paid $6,700 to speak to some of their students. Do you, in your capacity, have the ability to speak out when some of the people that you work with are found doing things that are unfavorable?
Well, I mean, obviously, yeah, we do. And I've worked with YAL a lot since 2018. And I think Young Americans for Liberty, and you see a lot of the people that work with the organization, even a lot of the people that are frustrated with the leadership of the organization, saying that the organization itself has done a lot of really good work. Now, I believe, if I remember correctly, there was one, possibly two allegations against Cliff Maloney directly. One, I think, was there was an investigation, I think, that was launched back in 2017. And I believe the results of that was that he was not found to have done anything wrong in that case, but I don't know that for sure. When somebody makes an accusation, I think that should be taken seriously. I think there should be an investigation, but I also think that, like anybody else, I believe in due process, and due process is not just a legal concept. Due process is a way that we actually look at accusations. It's about allowing each side to be able to provide a defense and provide their perspective with respect to what happened. Now, anybody that engages in sexual assault or sexual harassment, they deserve to be punished for that. There's no question. But I also think that people have a right to be able to articulate, and especially if they're saying that what somebody else says never took place, well, then they also have a right to share their version of events. And then, through an investigation and through careful analysis of the evidence, we should be able to come to a conclusion. And if somebody's guilty of something, they should be punished appropriately. And so there's an investigation going right now, and I'm going to withhold judgment until that investigation is complete. But one of the problems I have, and you saw this in Virginia as well, it becomes very, very easy once an accusation is out there to essentially, deplatform, cancel somebody, or essentially convict them in the court of public opinion. And you certainly have a right to do that in the court of public opinion. But for me, due process is not just a legal concept. It is a social concept on how we look at accusations, how we look at facts, how we look at evidence, and hopefully reserving ultimate judgment until we've had an opportunity to review those facts in their entirety, not purely based off of accusations and not purely based off of somebody claiming they didn't do something.
I would like to move this back to some arguments we want to make here, and make the argument the proper way. And I started a rather heated one on Facebook on Martin Luther King.
Not you.
No, never, right? I made a comment that we observe Republicans supporting Martin Luther King Jr. quotes from a safe distance of over 60 years. And then there was 180 comments of vigorous disagreement. And that thread where stands is that Republicans fully appreciate his civil rights battle, that even King himself was a Republican. And as curious as that last notion is, I do want to look back to a 1961 quote from MLK that didn't get much play on Monday. Here it is. In our glorious fight for civil rights, we must guard against being fooled by false slogans such as right to work. It is a law to rob us of our civil rights and job rights. Its purpose is to destroy labor unions and the freedom of collective bargaining by which unions have improved wages and working conditions of everyone. We demand this fraud to be stopped. Our weapon is our vote. Now, if Dr. King was a Republican, then I would ask, where the hell did the anti-right to work Republicans fit?
Well, I mean, again, I think if you look at the whole history of the Republican Party, I don't think it's historically inaccurate at all to say that Martin Luther King, worked with a lot of good Republicans. And if you look at the Civil Rights Act, you had more Republicans voting for it than you did Democrats. Now, I think the Democrats have come a long way with respect to their party's position on issues of civil rights. It certainly wasn't that way for about the first 150 years of their history. And I think Dr. King recognized that. So I don't want to make a logical fallacy here when we say because we agree in one part, then, or because we don't agree on one thing, that therefore we agree on nothing. I think every Republican appreciates what Luther King did. Now, I'm sure you can find some Republicans that don't. I don't know any of them. And I'm certainly a huge fan of civil rights because, again, I take a very liberty-minded view of politics in general. When it comes to right to work, again, the question I come down to is what ultimately are we talking about? Because I don't have a problem with unions. I have a problem when the government decides to take a side in a debate or discussion between an employer and an employee. That's always my starting point. It's not for the employer or I'm for the union or against the employer or against the union. I'm against the government coming in.
Let us hope that he comes right back in.
We'll give it a few seconds. We'll give him a few seconds.
He was on a roll there.
I do enjoy what Nick has to say. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of his points, but I don't necessarily disagree with him either. He gave me something to really consider and chop up and process about the way we approach our school system. So it looks like Nick might be back. But he gives something to think about. I can see why his podcast is doing so well. I can really see why his podcast is doing so well. So
I don't know what that was. I see you.
Yeah, we're back to being fuzzy. Nick.
Well, it cleared up the first time, so it'll work out. I think we may have cut you off a bit in the midst of your stream of consciousness there, and I didn't want it. If you wanted to close it out regarding right to work. And now it looks like you froze.
Yeah, I think he's it must be that cold pepper weather.
Good weather in Culpeper.
I'm trying. So, hey, look, this has been the Beach Brothers Show, and we've been live with the good delegate, Nick Freitas. We're going to give him a few more seconds to try to tap back in. Technology sometimes is not for us. The same way I say that politically, blacks have no political friends. Sometimes technology is not our friend. And it looks like this is one of those times. Hey, any wrapping up statements you'd like to make about the delegate, Nick Freitas? He really had a lot of energy. There was another comment or so that came in from there were dozens of allegations of YAL members acting wrongfully. This one dealt with the 1934 national firearms provisions.
I mean, if you take a strict interpretation of how clear and overt the Second Amendment is, and look, this is coming from a guy who literally hates guns and doesn't want, the government, the military, the police, as well as private citizens to have guns. If you look at the Second Amendment, you shouldn't be disallowed from having submachine guns. You shouldn't be disallowed from having tanks because each of them are listed as an arm. And it was so broadly written that all of those things should be a right of the people as well, which is why I take some issue with the Second Amendment.
And you know me, I say arm yourself or harm yourself.
Exactly.
Particularly go ahead.
No, I was like to say that's why Nick's voice would actually be pretty good to discuss the topic of guns, and he's just topics about it. And I would really like him if we had him on for another minute or two to try to give us some thoughts on that. Or perhaps if we're running out on time and his choppiness just gets too much, then we need to have him back on. And that way we can give him another shot.
Well, yeah, we'll have to let him back on, and yeah, we'll have to have Nick back on. I would love to chop it up and have some more conversation about his interesting views, and I would love to get some more of the community's comments. So that there were a lot. These were just a few. We only got a chance to post a few of them. There were a lot, but you've been checking out the Beach Brothers show. I think that's going to be it. We'll have Nick next time he has the Ethernet. And
well, we'll see about that. But do I want to throw in any of our good old-fashioned sponsors on this day?
Oh yeah, let's go ahead and we didn't get a chance to do the sponsors. All right, so we definitely want to start with the sponsor that who makes us drive to work every day.
We don't want to drive ourselves crazy with faulty driving equipment, and especially with Virginia's new law that you can't have devices in your hand while you are driving. So if you want to drive safe, make sure you get yourself a safe car. And you can do that by going to Greenbrier Volkswagen, which is Southern Greenbrier Volkswagen, 1248 South Military Highway. Hop on in, speak to Charlie Roy, get yourself a nice safe car, and you can travel all around, all safe.
Yeah, I really like their website. On their website, you can see things with the Jetta, the Passat. You can find the sedans. You can find the compacts. You can find the SUVs. You can find the wagons. So, yeah, Southern Volkswagen Greenbrier. Southern Volkswagen Greenbrier. We also want to take the time to thank the great people at commonsenseforyou.com. Oh, actually, .org. commonsenseforyou.org. So this particular company has health and beauty products, such as this herbal tooth powder. We've learned that toothpaste might be good in cleaning, but it's not necessarily good for your body. But herbal tooth powder with these ingredients, which you can all pronounce. Cinnamon, you can pronounce cinnamon.
Cinnamon.
Stevia, you can pronounce stevia.
Stevia.
Right, so go to commonsenseforyou.org. You can find some of their great products. I use this bug off oil. It's a great oil in the summertime, and this is their detox your skin package. And I tell you, these beauty products are great. They're just great. I can't say enough good things about them. I use them every day. So go to commonsenseforyou.org. That's commonsenseforyou.org. And ladies, if you want your brows to make everyone say wow, you can be as beautiful as this young lady here by going to IamLitaWee.com. That's IamLitaWee.com. They provide microblading. IamLitaWee.com. That's IamLitaWee.com. And finally, I'm Seko Varner with Positive Vibes Financial. We provide investment money for real estate investors. So in this case, this gentleman purchased this property for $33,000 from family members. We provided him with 90% of the purchase price, 100% of the rehab price, which was $58,000. He's in the process of rehabbing that property right now. So if you're a real estate investor and you love to get some really great deals and terms on your money, on the funds, get in contact with me. Positive Vibes Financial, 757-932-0177. And with that, good brother, I think we're done for today.
I think we're done. I hope you all enjoyed. And the next time we have a show is actually tomorrow. We're going to have on Princess Blanding, an independent governor candidate. So everyone tune on in and expand your mind as to the possibilities of who could be your governor.
Wow, an independent governor candidate from the Liberation Party.
Liberation, exactly.
Liberation Party. All right. Not the Libertarian Party, which I thought initially, but the Liberation Party.
Mm-hmm.
And that's tomorrow, 7:15. This show was brought to you by Positive Vibes Incorporated, our consulting services. We do credit fixes. We do tax resolution. We lend private money and debt consolidation. So if you need some of these services, we're waiting here for you. Credit fixes, tax resolutions, private money, and debt consolidation. Make sure you call